Here is something most people have never thought about. A pile of wet hay generates heat on its own. No fire, no stove, no kindling, no fuel at all. Stack it deep enough against a wall, pack it tight, seal in the moisture, and the bacteria working through that organic matter raise the temperature inside that wall cavity by 8 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit above whatever the outside air is doing. Leave it there for 3 months, and that slow biological burn will outlast any woodpile a settler could afford to cut and haul and stack. It runs day and night, indifferent to whether you're asleep, requiring no feeding, going out in no wind. The same thing happens with horse manure, with wet sawdust, with composting grass, with the floor sweepings from a grain mill. Anything organic, packed moist, with the airflow limited, the bacteria get to work, and the bacteria generate heat as a byproduct of the chemistry they're running. This is not unusual or obscure. This is the same process that makes a compost pile steam on a January morning. It's the same process that heats a hot bed in a gardener's greenhouse in February. Columella, the Roman agricultural writer, described the technique in the 1st century A. German farmers in the Rhine Valley were packing manure against their barn walls every November and calling it Misthaufen Isolierung, midden insulation, by the 1840s. The biology was documented in the scientific literature by Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. In the winter of 1889, not one person in Wahpeton, Dakota Territory, knew any of this. One woman in Wahpeton understood all of it. She was 61 years old. She had $8 and a wool coat, and she was looking at a rusted-out blacksmith forge that nobody in town wanted. The man who had built 40 structures on the Dakota Plains in 22 years walked around that building and told her she would be dead before February. The grain merchant's wife called her eccentric at best and deranged at worst. The town watched her pack the exterior walls with horse dung and wet sawdust and shredded cattail stems, and had a long collective laugh about what they were seeing. The Ice Glaze came in December 1889. It sealed Wahpeton under 2 inches of solid ice, and then held the temperature at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 days without interruption. Woodpiles had become solid blocks, and axes bounced off frozen stovepipe. 3 families ended up sleeping on church pews because their stoves went out and their walls gave up. Inside the blacksmith forge, with 14 people sheltering from a wind that made the real temperature feel like minus 59 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature held at 53 degrees. The walls were working exactly as she had built them to work. Richland County sat at the southeastern corner of what was about to become North Dakota. Dakota Territory divided in 2 and joined the Union in November 1889, though most settlers barely noticed the change because the winter started arriving before the statehood celebrations finished. The Red River ran along the county's eastern boundary. Wahpeton sat at the northern end of the river valley, a town of roughly 2,000 people that had grown fast on wheat money and Northern Pacific rail access. The main street had a hotel, a hardware store, a feed merchant, 2 saloons, a church, a county recorder's office, and the general atmosphere of a place that had been moving fast for a decade and expected to keep moving. It was not a place that had much patience for people who moved slowly or differently, or in directions the town had not approved. Ragna Bjørnsdal had been born in Telemark, Norway, in 1828, the 4th of 7 children in a farming family that had worked the same valley for 3 generations. She was 26 when she came to the hard decision that Norway was not going to give her family what America might, and 33 when she and her husband Knut finally made the crossing in 1861. They started in Wisconsin, moved to Minnesota when Knut's brother sent word that the land there was better and cheaper, and moved again in 1876 to Dakota Territory when the homestead opportunities east of the Red River looked too good to ignore. She was 48 years old when they arrived in Richland County. By that point she had buried 2 children, one to diphtheria in Wisconsin in 1866, one to a wagon accident in Minnesota in 1871, and she had developed the particular clarity of a person who has carried grief and kept working anyway. She did not talk about her losses often. She did not talk about most things often. Knut was the one who talked. They built a real farm over the decade that followed. Not the rough-and-ready first-year kind, but a genuine working operation, 160 acres of wheat, a 2-room frame house with a proper plank floor and a Monarch cast-iron stove, a proper barn with a board floor in the milking section, a smokehouse, 4 draft horses, 11 head of cattle, and a sod-walled potato cellar that Ragna had designed herself, with the entrance facing northeast to reduce frost penetration. Knut had taken on debt twice against the land, $140 in 1884, to buy 2 of the horses, but the wheat prices in 1883 and 1884 had been good years, and by 1886 the outstanding amount was nearly cleared. Knut died in March 1887 of pneumonia. He was 64. He had been sick for 3 weeks, coughing in a way that Ragna knew from the first week was not going to improve, and then he was gone in the space of a Tuesday afternoon while she was out feeding the cattle. She came back inside and found him still in the chair by the stove. She was 59 years old. She had the farm, she had the livestock, she had the debts at their reduced level, and she had 2 adult sons. Dakota territorial law in 1887 gave widows what was called dower rights, a life estate in 1/3 of the husband's real property. This was not ownership, it was a life estate, the right to live there and use the income, but not to sell, not to mortgage, not to make binding decisions about the land's future. The other 2/3 went to the heirs. In practice, this meant that a widow in Ragna's position had the use of the farm but not the power over it, and if her adult children disagreed with how she was managing things, they had legal standing to challenge. Magnus was 31 and had been farming his own quarter-section claim 6 miles east. He was competent, practical, and had grown up watching his parents build a farm from raw prairie, which had given him a precise sense of what everything was worth and a somewhat less precise sense of other people's feelings about things. Anders was 28, had never liked farming, and had been working as a clerk in a Fargo dry goods firm since 1884. He came home perhaps twice a year. He had opinions about everything and working knowledge of almost nothing. Magnus arrived 2 weeks after the funeral with a deed transfer document prepared by a Fargo lawyer. It transferred full ownership of the Bjørnsdal farm jointly to Magnus and Anders, with a monthly payment of $12 to Ragna and the continued use of the smaller back room. The justification in the document cited the outstanding $140 note from 1884, which Magnus argued represented a debt the estate could not comfortably carry under uncertain wheat prices without proper management, by which he meant his management. The $140 note was real. Ragna had not known about it precisely, though she knew Knut had borrowed against the horses. Whether the farm was genuinely at risk of foreclosure without the transfer, or whether that was the kind of thing a lawyer could make sound credible enough that a 60-year-old widow with no money for her own legal counsel would simply accept it, that was a question she could not afford to investigate. She read the document twice, standing in the kitchen where she had spent 11 years cooking. She asked Magnus 3 questions. He answered them with the careful, patient tone of someone who has decided the conversation is essentially already concluded. She signed the document. Magnus moved his operation to the larger farm that spring. Anders came once from Fargo, offered extended commentary on the potato cellar drainage and the condition of the smokehouse roof, did no physical work, and returned to Fargo. The $12 per month arrived in April, skipped May, arrived in June, skipped July and August, because the wheat prices had done something unexpected and money was tight. and arrived again in September with a note from Magnus explaining that he expected regular payments to resume in October. In September 1889, Magnus announced that he was getting married. The woman was from Moorhead, Minnesota, and she would be moving to the farm. She would need the back room. He had discussed several possible arrangements with Anders, and the conclusion they had reached was that Ragna's situation had changed enough that she should consider other options. He offered her $8 cash. He said it with the look of a man who believes he is being more than fair. She took the $8 and folded them into her coat pocket. She packed her cedar, chest, the linens, Knut's Bible, her bone-handled sewing scissors from Telemark, 2 photographs, a small tin of the seeds she had been saving from the kitchen garden, and she walked off the farm that afternoon without looking back at it, because looking back at things has never been a strategy that gets anyone anywhere. She walked the 6 miles to Wahpeton and stood on the main street with her chest at her feet in the September afternoon and looked at the buildings. She was 61 years old with $8, and she was not going to the county poor farm. And she was not going to beg space in anyone's back room, and she was not going to ask the church for charity. Those were not positions she was taking out of pride exactly. They were positions she was taking because she was 61 years old, and she had been working and building and thinking for 40 years. And she was not going to stop now. She started looking for what she could buy. At the southeast end of Wahpeton, between Pier Olstad's lumber yard and a vacant lot where a tannery had burned in 1887, there was a building that the town had been trying to figure out what to do with for the better part of 7 years. It had been a blacksmith forge, built in 1878 by a man named Arvid Gunderson, who had arrived from Illinois with actual capital and a plan to service the farm implement repair needs of a growing county. The plan was not wrong exactly, the timing was the problem. Gunderson had arrived just as a Chicago implement company opened a repair depot 12 miles north, and within 3 years it had taken most of the trade that Gunderson had counted on. He operated at diminishing returns through 1882, then sold his tools, his horses, and his land claim, and went back to Illinois, leaving the building behind. Gunderson had built well, at least in the elements that mattered most. The structural frame was white oak, not the pine or cottonwood that most settlers used, but white oak that he had hauled from Wisconsin because he intended to build something permanent. White oak does not rot quickly. 11 years of Dakota weather had left it sound. The roof was a double layer of iron sheeting that Gunderson had imported from a Chicago supplier, proud of it because it would not burn and would not rot. The iron had rusted in the predictable ways, and roughly a third of the sheets had developed through holes, and one section above the rear wall had partially collapsed inward during a wet spring 3 years back. But the iron that remained was structurally attached to the oak rafters, and the rafters were still solid. The problems were obvious and numerous. The exterior siding planks on the north and west faces had warped in the freeze-thaw cycling of 11 Dakota winters, opening gaps large enough to put a hand through in several places. The south face was better but not tight. The door hung on one hinge. The single window on the east wall had lost its glass and been boarded with a plank that was itself starting to split. The packed earth floor had a forge pit at its center, a stone-lined depression 4 feet across and 2 feet deep, with a rusted iron grate across the top and nothing else. The room measured 18 feet wide and 22 feet deep, 396 square feet of cold, gap-ridden, partially open-roofed space. The town's general opinion about the forge building was that it was an eyesore and a liability, and someone ought to do something. The reason no one had done anything was that the ownership had become tangled. Gunderson had left without formally transferring the land, which had a separate title from the structure, and by the time anyone thought to sort it out, the county had a back tax lien on the property, 5 years of unpaid assessments, totaling $7.40. And the informal understanding was that whoever settled the lien got the building, but no one had wanted it enough to pay even $7.40 for the privilege of owning something that needed that much work. Ragna went to the county recorder's office and found Halvard Nesset behind his desk. Nesset was a careful, methodical man who had been keeping the county's records since 1881 and had seen most of what Dakota Territory could produce in terms of unusual transactions. She asked about the forge building. He found the ledger entry, $7.40. She put her $8 on the desk. He counted out 60 cents change and wrote her a receipt and a letter of occupancy claim. She asked for the letter specifically, which told him she had thought about it in advance. He provided it without argument. She walked out of the recorder's office with legal claim to the building and 60 cents in her pocket. She had until November, at the outside, to make it livable. The first thing Ragna did with the building was nothing. This was deliberate, and it took most of a day. She sat inside the forge shell from mid-morning until the light started to change, and she watched. She watched where the wind came through. She put her hand near the north wall in several places and felt the air moving against her palm. She looked at where the daylight entered through the gaps. She sat on the floor near the forge pit and put both palms down on the packed earth and held them there for a full minute. She walked to the east corner where the roof hole was the collapsed section and stood under it and felt the column of cold air dropping from above. By early afternoon she had a clear ranking of the building's problems. The north wall gaps were the worst by a significant margin, not just because they admitted cold, but because they admitted moving air, and moving air is categorically different from still cold air when it comes to heat loss. Still air, even cold still air, conducts heat away from a warm body at a measurable but manageable rate. Moving air wind, draft, infiltration strips heat from surfaces at rates that depend on air velocity and that scale up fast. A gap half an inch wide and 6 feet tall on the north face of a building in a Dakota winter is not a moderate problem. It is a continuous extraction system that runs free on wind energy and takes your heat with it. The roof hole was second. Cold air accumulates at the highest point of an interior space, and an opening there eliminates the stratification of warmer air near the ceiling that would otherwise provide some passive insulation for the occupied zone below. The floor was third, not a gap in the structural sense, but a surface that would drain heat from any body resting on it. Bare packed earth in December conducts warmth out of a sleeping person at a rate that, if the person has no barrier and no fire, will kill them before morning. The lack of a stove was fourth, which sounds like it should be first, but Ragna had already figured out that the stove was not actually the problem she had to solve. The problem she had to solve was heat retention, not heat generation. A stove with no wall insulation burns wood at a rate that a woman with 60 cents cannot afford. A properly prepared structure with minimal fire is survivable. The standard Dakota approach, maximum stove, minimum wall, was what was killing people in claim shacks when the wood ran short. She had 60 cents. She spent it on a pound of lard and a box of matches. Then she started finding what she needed for free. Pier Olstad's lumberyard occupied the lot directly north of the forge building. Olstad was a Hallingdal Norwegian who had come to Wahpeton in 1882 and built a steady business supplying dimension lumber to the farmers and builders of Richland County. He ran a tight operation, but a lumber operation generates waste that has no commercial value. The short-end cut-offs, the warped boards pulled from deliveries, the sawdust and shavings that accumulated on the floor and in piles behind the building. Ragna knocked on his office door and asked if she could have his sweet pile. Olstad looked at her for a moment. She was a Norwegian woman of his parents' generation, and she had the direct manner of someone who has thought through what she's going to say before she says it. He said yes, she could have the sweet pile, and if she wanted the 3-year sawdust heap behind the south wall he'd been meaning to clear it, she was welcome to that as well. He sent his boy over with a wheelbarrow. The sawdust heap was roughly 8 feet across and 4 feet high at its peak, partially compacted by 3 years of weather, damp throughout its interior, and warm, actually warm to the touch a few inches below the crust. Ragna pressed her hand into it and held it there. The bacteria had been working it for 3 years. She could feel the result. She spent 3 days moving sawdust to the forge building. She packed it against the north exterior wall in a continuous berm, 6 feet wide at the base, 3 feet high, running the full 22-foot length of the north face. She wet it further from Ulstad's well, a light application, enough to keep the interior moisture at a level that sustained bacterial activity without soaking out, then covered the outer face of the berm with a row of salvage boards she had found in the vacant tannery lot. The boards were charred at the edges from the fire, but structurally intact. Their job was not insulation. Their job was to prevent the wind from drying the berm's surface before the decomposition got established. For the north wall gaps themselves, she worked from inside. She walked the creek at the edge of town in late September and pulled cattail stems. By this point in autumn, the seed heads had already released their fluff, but the stems and leaf bases were still fibrous and abundant. She broke and shredded them by hand into a loose, long fibre mass and worked it into every gap she could see light through on the north and west walls. Cattail fibre packs into a dense interlocking mesh that still air cannot penetrate. It compresses into gaps and seals them without any adhesive required. She sealed the exterior seams with lard, the single pound she had purchased, rendered slightly warm. Lard fills a gap and freezes into a rigid seal when the temperature drops. It would not last forever, and she knew it. But it would last long enough for the sawdust berm to establish and take over the insulation work. The roof hole she covered from inside. She found boards in the tannery lot long enough to bridge the gap, laid them across at the attic level as a rough ceiling patch, and piled 2 feet of sawdust on top of them. This created a dead air space between the patch and the rusted iron above, an enclosed, still air pocket approximately 20 inches thick. Still air, trapped and unable to convect, provides roughly R3/5 per inch of insulation in an enclosed space. 20 inches of still air above that patched ceiling section gave approximately R70 more than any other part of the building by a wide margin. The floor was the piece she was most careful about, and the piece that made Sinja Dahl's comment accurate in a way Sinja had not intended. 3 blocks north, behind Radar Krog's livery stable, a 2-year accumulation of horse manure sat in a pile that Krog had not gotten around to hauling to the fields. It was the particular problem of prosperous livery stable operators. The horses produced it continuously, and the fields could absorb it productively, but getting it from one to the other required time that was always being spent on something more immediately pressing. Krog had 6 horses in regular use and a pile that had grown considerably. Ragna came to see him. He told her to take as much as she wanted and sent his son to help her load the wheelbarrow. She moved horse manure to the forge for 4 days. She spread it across the entire floor in a continuous layer 12 inches deep and tamped it firmly with a plank. Over that she laid a mixture of sawdust and the dry grass she raked from the tannery lot another 8 inches, loose and mixed. Over that she laid every flat salvage board she had found, cut and fitted to cover the surface, giving her a rough but walkable floor deck above the organic layers. The reasoning was layered. The horse manure, moist and packed, would begin decomposing within 2 weeks. The decomposition would generate heat upward through the sawdust and grass intermediate layer and through the board deck into the room. The ground below the manure in early October, before the hard frost had fully penetrated, still held summer warmth at depths below 12 inches. In Dakota Territory, soil at 1 foot depth in October runs approximately 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The 20 inches of organic material above that ground layer would slow the frost line's downward penetration significantly. Where an unprotected earth floor in a Wahpeton claim shack might be frozen solid by December, Ragna's floor would stay biologically active and therefore warm through the worst of the winter. She left the forge pit uncovered for now, The stone ring that lined it, limestone blocks, each roughly 8 inches thick, set in a rough circle, was cold. But it was there, and she had a plan for it. From the outside, the project looked exactly as alarming as the town thought it looked. The north wall had an enormous dark mound packed against it that smelled of wet wood and earth. The interior floor was a mixture of dark, organic material and salvage boards that smelled considerably stronger. The cattail fibre stuffed into the wall gaps gave the building the appearance of something that had been insulated by a large and determined bird. Thorvald Engeset, who was the closest thing Wahpeton had to a professional builder, walked past the forge on his way to the feed store on a Wednesday morning and stopped to look. He pressed on the north wall from the outside, noted the sawdust berm, and spent about 2 minutes assessing what he saw. Then he knocked on the door frame. Ragna was inside, fitting boards to the floor. "Mrs. Bjørnsdal," Engeset said, in Norwegian, because they were both Norwegian and some habits are permanent. "I want to give you an honest assessment." "Go ahead," she said, without stopping work. He told her what he saw. The gaps in the north planks were a heat loss problem that a sawdust pile outside the wall wouldn't adequately address. The roof hole was a structural concern as well as a thermal one. The floor was going to be damp once the frost set in, which would make it miserable to sleep on and potentially dangerous. She had no stove. She had, as far as he could tell, no money for firewood even if she acquired one. He had been building in Dakota Territory since 1867, and he knew what a winter here did to inadequately prepared structures. He told her she would be dead before February. He said it plainly, without cruelty. He genuinely believed it. "I appreciate you coming to tell me," Ragna said. Engeset left and stopped at the feed store and told the men there what he had seen, and the story moved through Wahpeton with the speed that stories in small towns always move. By evening, the general understanding was that the Bjørnsdal widow had set up in the old forge and was packing it with manure and sawdust and planning to live there. Signy Dahl heard the story at the quilting circle 2 days later and considered it carefully before delivering her assessment. "She's packing herself in like a dead horse," Signy said, meaning that people used to bury dead horses under midden heaps in the old country to help with the smell, and that what Ragna was doing with herself was roughly equivalent. The women at the quilting circle thought this was accurate, and the phrase spread through the town. Ragna, who heard it third hand a week later, found it funnier than anyone expected her to. The forge pit was the centre of her heating plan, and it took her until the 2nd week of October to execute it fully. What Gunderson had left behind was not just a stone-lined depression in the floor. It was approximately 900 pounds of limestone blocks arranged in a rough circle, each block 8 to 10 inches thick, mortared loosely to adjacent blocks and to the earthen floor beneath. When Gunderson ran it, that pit had been a working forge, a fire chamber designed to reach temperatures above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit so that iron became workable. Ragna did not need iron working temperatures. She needed the stone to store heat and release it through the night. That is a different problem, and a much more achievable one. Limestone has a specific heat of approximately 0.22 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That number 0.22 is worth understanding carefully because it explains why dense stone has been used for heating storage in cold climates for centuries. To raise 900 pounds of limestone by a single degree Fahrenheit requires 198 British thermal units of energy. To raise the same limestone by 100 degrees takes 19,800 British thermal units. At 200 degrees above ambient, which a proper fire in a stone-lined pit achieves comfortably, those limestone blocks store 39,600 British thermal units of thermal energy. The key word in that number is store. A cast iron stove of equivalent weight stores roughly 1/5 as much energy per pound. Because iron's specific heat is only about 0.1, 1 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. The iron stove heats the room fast and loses its heat fast when the fire goes out. The limestone ring heats slowly and releases slowly infrared radiation from the warm stone surface, reaching the walls and floor and people in the room directly, without needing to warm the air in between. The air in the room on a winter night at -20 outside might be 45 degrees. The stone surface, radiating at 120 degrees above ambient, is still warming every person in the room, even if the air around them is cold. This distinction between convective heat and radiant heat matters more in a building with wall gaps than it might in a perfectly sealed structure. Convective heat warms the air, and air leaks. Radiant heat from a warm surface travels as electromagnetic waves and arrives at whatever surface it strikes, regardless of what the intervening air temperature is. Standing near a campfire on a cold night, you feel warm on the side facing the fire, even when the air temperature around you is freezing. That is radiant heat. The limestone ring in Ragna's forge operated on the same principle at a lower temperature, but over a much longer duration. That stored energy doesn't release instantly. Dense stone releases heat slowly through radiation, the warm surface radiating infrared energy to cooler surrounding surfaces, including walls, floor, and people. A well-fired limestone mass at 200 degrees above ambient, in a reasonably sealed space, radiates its stored energy over 12 to 14 hours. At the lower output rate, 2,000 to 3,000 British thermal units per hour, that is not dramatic heat. It is exactly enough to hold a sealed 396 square foot room significantly above freezing through a Dakota night, provided the walls are doing their part alongside it. What Ragna understood standing in the forge in early October looking at the cold stone ring was that she had a thermal battery sitting in the middle of her floor. All she needed was to charge it every few days and let it run. The question was what to charge it with. To heat the stones, she needed fuel. Specifically, she needed fuel she could get without money. She walked to the Northern Pacific Depot. Every railroad town in Dakota Territory in 1889 had the same problem. The locomotives burned coal, and coal combustion is imperfect. The unburned residue clinker, a fused mixture of coal, ash, and partially combusted material, accumulated along the trackside. The railroad had no use for it. It was too spent to burn efficiently in a locomotive, but not entirely inert either. Left in a proper forge with good draft, clinker would sustain a fire with the addition of dry wood to start it. A sack of clinker and 3 sticks of dry lumber gave you 2 hours of forge-quality heat. The yardmaster watched Ragna fill 2 grain sacks from the trackside pile. He said nothing because the alternative was shoveling it himself. The wood she needed for the initial burn she had already arranged. She spent a morning sealing the gaps around Pier Olstad's lumberyard's north-facing door with cattail fibre, a job that took her about 2 hours and that Olstad had mentioned needing done for 3 years. In exchange, he gave her a pile of dry-end lumber cuts too short for any commercial purpose but perfectly adequate for burning. She hauled it to the forge in the wheelbarrow. On October 24th, she lit the first forge fire. She used 3 of Olstad's end cuts and a full sack of clinker, building the fire in the forge pit and running it hot for 4 hours. The iron grate across the pit turned red at its edges. The limestone blocks absorbed the heat in the slow, thorough way of dense stone, not dramatic, not rapid, but relentless. By the time she let the fire drop to coals, the stones were too hot to touch. She sealed the room as tightly as she could, the door gap stuffed with a folded blanket. Every cattail plug checked and repacked, and lay down on the board floor above the manure, and sawdust underlayer with her wool coat over her, and Knut's Bible under her head, because it was the right thickness for that. Purpose. In the morning, the limestone ring was still noticeably warm. The cup of water she had placed near the north wall, in the coldest spot in the room, had not frozen. She lay there for a while after she woke, listening to the cold outside, and thought about the first winter she had spent in Wisconsin in 1861, When she and Knut had lived for 4 months in a single room with a fireplace that ate wood the way a fire eats wood, and still left them cold on the floor farthest from it, she thought about Knut's neighbour in Telemark in 1864, who had packed his cattle barn with the old midden, and whose animals had been warmer that February than any previous winter. She thought about the Telemark winter of 1855 when she was 27, and her father's farm buildings had been the warmest in the valley, because her father built differently from everyone else, thicker walls. More earth against the north face, always. Knowledge moves through families and through communities the way heat moves through stone slowly, but once it is there, it stays. Through October and into November, she kept working. She extended the sawdust berm along the west wall as well, using additional material from Olstad's sweep pile and from the floor sweepings of the county grain elevator, which the elevator manager was happy to let her take because he had been meaning to clear them for months. The west berm was not as deep as the north, 4 feet wide instead of 6, but it was sufficient to address the secondary wind exposure. The south and east faces she left without berms for the time being, because those faces got what little winter sun was available, and she did not want to block it. The manure floor was well established by late October. She could feel the warmth through the boards when she pressed her palm down in the morning. The biological process was running. She did not know the precise temperature contribution, she had no thermometer, but the cup test was reliable. Water near the north wall was consistently above freezing, even on nights when the outside temperature dropped below 0. She burned the forge, perhaps every 3 days. One fire, 2 to 3 hours. Limestone blocks charged and radiating for the following 12 to 14 hours. Her fuel expenditure for October was half a grain sack of clinker and perhaps a dozen of Olstad's end cuts, less than an hour's worth of firewood by any standard measure. Thorvald Engeset walked past the forge on a morning in early November when the temperature was 14 below. He stopped outside and pressed his hand against the north wall planks, curious about the sawdust berm. He held it there for a while. The wood under his hand was cold to the touch, not warm, but considerably less cold than the open air beside the wall. He made a mental note and kept walking. He came back 4 days later and knocked on the door. Ragna let him in. He stood inside looking at the space, the board floor, the forge pit, the patched ceiling, the cattail stuffed gaps, the faint smell of organic decomposition from the floor layers and the berm outside. He walked to the north wall and pressed both palms flat against the interior face of the planks. He held them there for a long moment. The planks were warmer than the interior air. He had never felt that before. In every structure he had built or assessed in 22 years on the Dakota Plains, walls were always colder than the room's interior air, because the room's interior air was what you were heating, and the walls were what you were heating it against. A wall warmer than the room meant the wall was contributing heat to the room, not extracting it. The wall is giving off heat, he said. The berm is 7 weeks old, Ragna said. She was sitting on her stool near the forge pit, mending a glove. The bacteria are running fully now. He turned around. Bacteria. In the wet sawdust. They consume the organic material. The consumption generates heat. It's the same process that makes a compost pile steam in January. She said it simply, without the tone of someone explaining something they expect to be disbelieved. Engeset stood there and thought about this. He had seen compost piles steam. He had never made the connection to building applications. How long will it run? Until the material is consumed. At the current depth and moisture level, probably through March. By then the outside temperatures will be mild enough that it doesn't matter. He pressed the wall again. He was not a man who gave ground easily, but he was a man who respected observable fact, and the observable fact under his palms was real. Mrs. Bjørnsdal, he said, I told you this wouldn't work. I remember. I want to understand what I got wrong, she told him. Not the biology, she did not know the biology in precise terms, but the engineering logic. The sawdust berm was not just insulating the wall, it was heating the wall from the outside, which meant the wall was not a barrier trying to resist the temperature differential, but a zone of active heat addition. Combined with the manure floor generating heat from below and the limestone ring storing and releasing heat from the centre, the structure was running 3 independent heat sources simultaneously, none of them requiring fuel input once established, except for the forge fires which she burned once every 3 days. Engeset stood at the north wall for a long time after she finished talking. Then he walked to the door. "I'd like to come back," he said. "Come back whenever you want," she said. He came back twice more in November, each time with more precise questions about the berm composition and the moisture management and the depth of the manure floor layer. She answered him precisely because the questions were good ones. December in Dakota Territory arrives with a particular quality of threat that people who have not experienced it cannot fully convey to those who haven't. It is not simply cold. The cold of October and November is preparation. Almost instructional here is what cold feels like. Pay attention. December is the examination. November cold kills you if you're careless. December cold kills you if you're merely average. The settlers who had been on the plains for a decade knew the signs. The light in late November started going flat in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. The cattle stood differently, backs to the northwest, heads down lower than usual, a behavioral shift that experienced farmers read as a barometric indicator, more reliable than any instrument. The magpies disappeared. In years when the magpies stayed through December, the winter was usually manageable. When they left, experienced settlers tightened everything they could tighten and counted their wood. The magpies left Wahpeton in the last week of November, 1889. The first hard temperature of the season came December 4th, -17 Fahrenheit, with a northwest wind at 19 miles per hour. Then a brief, mild spell 3 days above zero, which felt generous, and which the settlers spent checking their wood piles and trying to convince themselves the weather had broken early. Before December 15th arrived, freezing rain began that evening. It came from a southern warm front pushing north that met the Arctic air mass sitting over the territory. And the result was precipitation that fell as liquid and froze the instant it contacted any surface below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. By the morning of December 16th, Wahpeton was sealed. Every horizontal surface in the county, every roof, every porch board, every wheel rim, every woodpile, every fence rail, every surface of every object left outside carried 2 inches of solid, clear ice. The ice was beautiful in the way that beautiful things can be when they are also dangerous. It reflected the morning light off every surface simultaneously. And on the morning of the 16th, walking from the hotel to the hardware store was a slow, flat-footed shuffling exercise that 3 men performed, and 2 of them fell doing it. And then the temperature fell, -18 on the 16th, -22 on the 17th, -26 on the 18th. The wind held from the northwest at 16 to 18 miles per hour throughout, which pushed the effective temperature, the wind chill, the experienced cold on exposed skin to approximately 55 to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At those wind chill values, bare skin develops frostbite in under 5 minutes. The distinction between the wind chill number and the actual temperature is not academic in those conditions. It is the difference between what the thermometer reads and what your body experiences, and your body is not reading the thermometer. Every woodpile in Wahpeton was now a solid block. You could see men on the morning of the 16th going to their stacks and discovering the problem. The wood that had been stacked loose and accessible the previous evening had been sealed by 2 inches of ice into a single fused mass that required an axe to separate, and the axe heads bounced off. You could hear them across the street, that particular sound of an axe hitting ice over wood, a sharp ring that carries through cold air and sounds almost musical until you understand what it means. A man who could separate 3 sticks from his frozen woodpile in 20 minutes of hard work was doing well. Stovepipes were cracking. Cast iron, when thermal cycling takes it from very hot fire temperature, several hundred degrees, to very cold exterior exposure in -20-degree air, develops stress fractures that propagate through the pipe wall. The cycling itself is the problem. Expansion and contraction at rates that the metal cannot accommodate without failing. The Haugen family, whose claim shack sat on the northwest edge of town with insufficient insulation in the north wall and a stovepipe that had been sound in November, discovered a hairline crack in the pipe wall on the evening of the 17th. They made the decision to send their 3 children to the church that evening rather than risk carbon monoxide accumulation from a compromised flue. The parents stayed one more night and followed the next morning. The Grew family, Anders Grew, his wife Kjellog, and their 4 children, ranging in age from 3 to 11, had made it through the night of the 18th by burning at a rate that they knew precisely was unsustainable. Anders had been a farmer long enough to calculate fuel supply versus temperature need, and by the evening of the 18th he knew the numbers. Their remaining wood, accessible only with considerable effort through the ice coating, would last 2 more days at the current burn rate. The temperature on the 19th showed no sign of lifting. The sky to the north was the same flat, colourless white it had been for 4 days, which was the sky that experienced Dakota settlers had learned to read as extended cold rather than imminent break. The stove was running hot enough that the wall immediately beside it was warm. The wall 6 feet away was coated in a thin frost that came from the moisture in the interior air contacting the cold surface of the planks. A standard frame wall in a Wahpeton claim shack board siding, no insulation. 1 inch of wood between interior and exterior has an effective thermal resistance of approximately R1, 5 to R2, 5 for the wall system as a whole. At -26 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 55 degrees inside, that wall is trying to hold an 81-degree temperature differential against a resistance equivalent to wrapping the building in a few thin wool blankets. The physics are merciless. Every hour that passes, heat flows outward through those planks at a rate determined entirely by the temperature differential and the wall's resistance. The fire compensates. When the wood runs out, the temperature inside the building slides toward equilibrium with the outside. By December 19th, the slide had started in multiple Wahpeton households. Borghild Skarstad, a widow who lived alone with her teenage son Arn in a 1-room frame shack on the south end of town, had her stovepipe crack completely on the night of the 18th. Not a hairline crack, but a full separation at a joint that the ice and cold had worked through the insulating wrap she had packed around it in November. She plugged the gap with a wet rag, which froze solid within 15 minutes and sealed the gap temporarily. By 2 in the morning, the rag had thawed from the stove heat, the draft was compromised, and smoke was accumulating in the lower half of the room. She and Arn left at first light and walked to the church in the dark, on ice, in -28-degree air, carrying what they could carry. The church, which the congregation collectively maintained with a proper woodpile and a working stove replaced 2 years prior, became Wahpeton's emergency shelter by the morning of December 19th. By that evening, 11 people were sleeping on pews. The Lutheran pastor, a man named Einar Fjeld, was burning the church's winter supply at a rate that would exhaust it before February if the cold held, and he knew it. He was also running out of floor space. Signe Dahl walked up the road to the forge building in the dark on the morning of December 19th. She did not bring her husband. She did not bring anyone. She came alone because she needed to, and she came at 7 in the morning because the situation had progressed past the point where social considerations were the relevant factor. She had been up since 4:30. She had stood at her kitchen window in the dark and watched a man across the street Anders Gru's neighbour try to separate wood from a frozen pile for 40 minutes before giving up and going back inside. She had heard from the pastor's wife at 6 that Borghild Skarstad and her son had come to the church before sunrise, walking on the ice in the dark because the stovepipe was gone and the room was full of smoke. The phrase she had said in October, packing herself in like a dead horse, had been sitting with her for 3 days, changing shape every time she thought about it. At the quilting circle it had been clever. By December 17th, it was starting to feel less so. She knocked on the forge door. Ragna opened it. The first thing Signe noticed was the smell still organic, but faintly sweet now, nothing like the raw, sharp odour of the freshly placed manure she had stepped back from in October. This was the smell of material well into its 3-month cycle, earth deep, almost like a barn that has been kept cleanly through spring, the smell of something alive and working. The second thing she noticed was the warmth. Not the aggressive wall of heat that blasts out of an over-fired stove in a cold house. Something different. Steady, pervasive. The kind of warmth that comes from multiple sources that have been working for a long time. It was the warmth of a space that had accumulated thermal history over weeks. Ragna stepped back from the door. "Come in." Signe came in. Ragna closed the door behind her. The forge pit had a small fire, 3 pieces of Olstad scrap lumber and half a sack of clinker, burning slowly, the limestone ring warming steadily around it. The board floor was noticeably warm under Signe's feet through her boots, which she noticed because she had walked across 2 inches of ice and frozen ground to get there. The contrast was considerable. The room temperature was probably 52 degrees. Outside, that morning, -28 Fahrenheit with an 18-mile-per-hour wind, a wind chill of approximately -59 degrees. Signe sat on the wooden stool. She did not speak for a while. She pressed 1 foot flat on the floorboard and held it there, feeling the warmth rise through the leather. Ragna made tea from the clay jug she kept near the forge stones, which the stones kept consistently warm enough that it never needed reheating. She handed Signe a cup. "The Gru family," Signe said. "Their wood is almost gone. The Haugans sent their children to the church on the 17th. Borghild Skarstad's pipe cracked. How many people? 14 between those 3 families." Signe looked at the room, then looked at it again more carefully, not the way she had looked in October, cataloguing absurdities, but the way you look at something when you are trying to understand it. She looked at the walls and the floor and the stone ring in the forge pit. Can they fit? Ragna looked at the room with her. 396 square feet, 14 people, plus herself. The organic heat sources in the walls and floor did not care how many people were in the room. They were running on their own fuel, independent of occupancy. The limestone ring's stored BTU was determined by how hot she had fired it the previous evening, which was quite hot. She had anticipated something like this. When you have built something that works and the weather turns toward catastrophe, you charge your batteries in advance. 14 bodies in a sealed space add roughly 4,900 BTU per hour of biological warmth, which in a well-insulated building is not trivial. Resting adult bodies are not dramatic heat sources, but they are consistent and they are free. "They can come," she said. Signe looked at her for a moment. "I told people you were packing yourself in like a dead horse." "I heard that." A pause. "I was wrong about what you were doing." "I know," Ragna said. "Go get the Grus." The Gru family arrived that evening. Anders and Kjellaug and 4 children, the youngest 3 years old, and carried in Kjellaug's arms the whole way. They had walked from 2 blocks east on ice that had not softened since it formed 4 days before. Anders carried the youngest in one arm and a bundle of the family's wool blankets in the other. Kjellaug moved with the particular, careful determination of a woman who has decided that falling is not an option. The 4 children came behind, the oldest 11 holding the hand of the 7-year-old who was holding the hand of the 5-year-old, a chain of children on ice in the dark. The Haugen family came from the church, the parents, who had assumed their children were adequate to the church's warmth without them, discovered on the 19th that their own home was running out of time, and that sleeping on a church pew was better than what would happen if the remaining wood went to ash before morning. They arrived with nothing except what they were wearing, which told Ragna everything she needed to know about how quickly the decision had been made. Borghild Skarstad and her son Arn came last, walking carefully on the ice from the south end of town. Borghild was carrying her husband's old Bible. Her husband had been dead for 6 years, and she had kept almost nothing from the marriage. But she had kept the Bible, and Arn was carrying the iron pot that was Borghild's only cooking implement. Ragna noticed the pot and said nothing about it. The gesture of bringing the pot meant Borghild intended to stay until the weather changed, however long that took. 15 people in 396 square feet. Ragna herself was the 15th. She had cleared the floor of everything except the stool, which the smallest children could take turns sitting on, and arranged the salvage boards she had not yet used as additional floor surface along the east wall. Ragna burned one fire that evening, 4 sticks of Olstad's end-cut lumber and a full sack of clinker, built in the forge pit with the draft open, burning approximately 2 hours. The limestone ring absorbed the heat with the patient thoroughness of dense stone, not fast, but completely. By the time she let the fire drop to coals and then let it die entirely, the stones were too hot to hold a hand against. She sealed the door gap with the folded blanket, checked every cattail plug in the north wall by pressing her palm against each one in sequence, and sealed the east window board's edges with a strip of cloth from a rag she kept for the purpose. She put the 3 youngest children on the board floor closest to the forge pit, where the limestone radiated most directly. The adults arranged themselves around the room's perimeter. Every wool coat in the building was in use as either covering or sleeping mat. Kelogru lay on her back with her 3-year-old on her chest under 2 coats, the child's weight and warmth combined. Borghild, Skarstad and Arn sat back to back against the east wall, which was the most sheltered from the wind, sharing 1 coat between them. The temperature outside that night, December 19th into December 20th, was minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had dropped slightly from the previous days to 12 miles per hour sustained, which brought the wind chill down from minus 59 to approximately minus 53. The cold was the kind that makes timber contract, and the iron nails in that timber contract at different rates, so that buildings produce sounds like muffled rifle shots through the night as the differential stress releases. In the frame houses and claim shacks around Wapton, those sounds were constant. People who had lived through Dakota winters knew the sounds as winter talk, the building complaining about what it was being asked to do. Inside the forge, the sounds were different. The stone ring in the forge pit contracted slightly as it cooled over the hours, producing a low, occasional tick that was nothing like the sharp crack of stressed timber. The organic material in the walls and floor made no sound at all. The bacterial processes generating heat in the sawdust berm and the manure floor ran in complete silence. The only sounds were the breathing of 15 people and, twice in the night, one of the younger Gru children shifting on the floor and settling again. Ragna did not sleep immediately. She lay on her board floor with her wool coat and Knut's Bible and listened to the room doing what she had built it to do. The limestone ring was warm beside her. She could feel the radiant heat on the side of her face closest to it, even as the air between her and the stone was cool. That asymmetry, warm face, cool air was the signature of radiant heating, and it was what the Russian and Finnish masonry heater traditions had been engineering for 400 years. The heat travelling from a warm surface to a person without needing to warm the air in between. You feel the source, not the medium. She was thinking about Knut. She thought about him often in December, because December was when he had been most himself practical, calm, checking and rechecking the barn latch and the stovepipe and the woodpile with the focused attention of a man who understood that winter was not something you survived casually. He would have understood what she had built. He would have had questions about the moisture management in the berm, and she would have answered them. And he would have stood at the north wall and pressed his hand against it the way Engeset had pressed his hand against it, and said something careful and accurate. He had been good at careful and accurate. A cup of water that Ragna had placed near the north wall, the coldest spot in the room, the spot that would freeze first if the building systems were failing, had not frozen by midnight when she checked it. Had not frozen at 2 a.m. when the youngest, Gru child woke crying briefly and she got up to check. Had not frozen at 4:30 when the cold outside, she could feel through the floor vibration, was reaching its overnight minimum. By morning the room was 57 degrees. 15 people were sheltered in that room, sustained by a sawdust berm that had been biologically active for 11 weeks, 12 inches of composting horse manure under the boards, 900 pounds of warmed limestone, releasing stored BTU at a slow, steady rate, and 60 cents total material expenditure after the building purchase, all of it, holding against minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit outside, keeping the interior at 57 degrees. Anders Gru sat up in the early morning light and looked at the north wall for a long time without speaking. He got up, crossed the room carefully without waking the children, and pressed his hand flat against the interior face of the north planks. He held it there. He had grown up in Telemark. His family had come from the Numedal Valley, 2 valleys east of where Ragna was from, and the hand against the warm plank was doing something to a memory he had not touched in 20 years. "My grandfather," he said quietly, to no one in particular. The 3 children on the floor did not stir. He packed his barn walls with the old midden every November, said it kept the animals warm through February. He was very particular about it, the moisture level, when to start, how deep. I thought it was just an old man being particular about things that didn't need to be particular about. Ragna, who had been awake since 4:30, said from her side of the room, "It wasn't." Anders kept his hand on the wall. "It was the same thing." Ragna said that it was. Thorvald Engeset came to the forge on December 21st. He had not been invited. He had heard from his neighbour that the Grus and Haugens and the Skarstad widow were sheltering there, and he came, he told people afterward, because he was concerned about the structural safety of having that many people in a building that he had assessed as inadequate. This was true as far as it went, but the fuller truth was that he was curious, and that he had been thinking about the warm wall he had felt in November ever since, and that December 21st was the first morning since the 15th, that the temperature had come up enough minus 15 instead of minus 28, that he could make the walk without it being reckless. He knocked, and Ragna opened the door. He stepped inside. He saw the 14 people, the 3 children on the floor, the Gru and Haugen families arranged along the walls, Borghild Skarstad and her son near the east corner. He saw the forge pit with its cooling limestone ring. He saw the board floor, the salvaged ceiling patch, the cattail stuffed walls. He walked directly to the north wall. He pressed both palms flat against the interior face of the planks and stood there with his eyes closed. The children watched him. The adults watched him. The planks were warmer than the interior air. He stood at that wall for longer than was strictly necessary for assessment purposes. Then he turned around. "Mrs. Bjørnsdal," he said. "Mr. Engeset, I told you in October that this would not work. I want to say that I was wrong about which part." He looked at the room. "I was right that the building as it stood would not hold heat. I was wrong about what you intended to do with the building." Nobody said anything. The children had lost interest and gone back to whatever they had been doing. The Gru and Haugen adults were looking at Engeset with expressions that suggested they had not previously seen the county's chief building authority admit a specific error in public. "What exactly is the berm doing?" he said. She explained it again, in more detail than she had in November, because now there was an audience. and because the ice glaze outside had made the explanation easier. The bacteria in the wet sawdust had been consuming the organic material for 11 weeks. The consumption generated heat, the same heat that made a compost pile steam, the same heat that a hotbed in a garden uses to start seedlings in cold soil. The heat migrated inward, through the sawdust mass and through the wall planks into the room. The interior face of the north wall was warmer than the room air, because the wall was a heat source, not just a barrier. The manure floor was running the same process in the floor plane. 12 inches of horse manure in active decomposition generated warmth upward through the sawdust and grass intermediate layer and through the board deck. The biological heat was modest, not the dramatic output of a stove, but it was continuous. It ran through the night when the fire was out. It ran regardless of whether she was awake to tend it. The limestone ring was the third layer, charged every 2 to 3 days with a small, efficient fire, releasing stored heat slowly over the following 12 to 14 hours, not as hot air rising through the room. Radiant infrared from the warm stone surfaces, reaching the people and walls and floor directly without needing to heat the intermediate air. Engeset listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he went outside and pressed into the top of the sawdust berm and held his hand there. The interior of the pile was warm, not as warm as a human body, not as warm as a stove, but clearly above the -15-degree air that surrounded it. He held his hand there for a long moment. He came back inside. He sat down on the floor, the only available space, and said, "I need to understand this better. Will you explain it again from the beginning?" She walked him through it again from the start, covering the sawdust berm, the manure floor, the limestone ring, and the logic that connected all three. The ice glaze of 1,889 broke on January 4th, 1,890, when a warm front moved up from the south and pushed the temperatures above zero for the first time in 3 weeks. The ice crust that had sealed everything began releasing. A cracking, dripping, a sliding process that produced sounds like distant thunder, and then the general noise of a town coming back to life from underneath something heavy. 9 days at or below -28 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 inches of ice that had sealed every surface, every woodpile, every door that opened outward. Temperatures that had held wind chills at -53 to -59 on the worst nights. One man in the county lost 3 toes to frostbite, walking between his barn and his house on the night of the 18th 40 yards, a walk he had made 1,000 times. And the cold had taken those 3 toes before he registered what was happening. 2 dairy farmers on the west side of town lost cattle they had not been able to reach through ice-sealed barn doors. The animals died at 68 degrees below the temperature their bodies could maintain, and nobody could get to them in time to do anything about it. The Svensson family's cast-iron stove cracked its firebox under repeated thermal cycling, and the stove was now an unusable iron box in the middle of their room. A new stove was $42, which was $42 they did not have after a difficult wheat season, which meant they would borrow against next year's crop and pay interest they could not afford either way. 3 claim shacks in the county that were still standing on the 5th of January had interior walls with frost damage that would require weeks of spring repair. One family, whose stovepipe had failed on the 17th, had attempted to heat their shack with an open fire in the fireplace rather than the stove, and the chimney, which had not been used in 2 years, had partially blocked with accumulated debris. They had survived by spending the worst 3 nights in their barn with the animals. The Grue family, the Haugen family, and Borghild Skarstad and her son Arn had lost nothing. Every member of every family was intact and uninjured. Their food stores were undisturbed. Their stovepipes were whole because they had not been using them. Their woodpiles were still frozen blocks, but frozen blocks were not a crisis because they hadn't needed the wood. They had slept warm every night of the 9 days. Anders Grue went home on January 5th to assess his claim shack. The frame structure had held structurally, he had built it more carefully than most, and the studs were sound, but the interior walls showed frost damage from the nights when the building had been unoccupied and the stove unlit. A frost bloom had formed on the inside face of the north and west planks, the moisture in the interior air condensing and freezing against the cold surface. It would dry out in spring and probably not cause permanent damage, but it was evidence of exactly what happened to a standard frame building when the heating failed. The interior temperature dropped toward the exterior, and the building began moving toward equilibrium with the outside air. He stood in his empty cold shack on the 5th and thought about the forge building. He thought about the north wall plank warm under his hand at 4 in the morning. He thought about 15 people breathing in a sealed room at -31 outside and the cup of water not freezing. He went to see Ragna on January 7th. He brought a question, which was his way of expressing what he could not say directly. He had a sawdust source. There was a small mill 3 miles east that produced more shavings than the owner could dispose of, and he had already spoken to the man informally. He had access to Reidar Krog's livery manure, now that he knew what to ask for. His claim shack had a north-facing wall that had always been the coldest wall in the building. He had a wife and 4 children, and what had happened in December was not something he was willing to let happen again. She walked him through it carefully. The moisture management was the part most people would get wrong, she told him the instinct, when packing organic material was either too dry, which prevented bacterial activation, or too wet, which drove the process anaerobic and slowed it. She described what the right moisture felt like in a handful of sawdust, dense and slightly cool, clumping slightly when squeezed, releasing no liquid. She described the covering, the salvage boards or old tin or anything that broke the wind without sealing the surface entirely, because the bacteria needed some air exchange. She described the timing with particular care. October, not November. The decomposition needed 4 to 6 weeks to establish at full activity before the hard cold arrived, and starting in November meant arriving at full activity in January, which was too late. He listened and asked precise questions. He left and came back 3 days later with more questions, and again a week after that. By the 3rd week of January, Engeset had come to her twice more, each time with a more technically detailed inquiry about the relationship between berm depth and heat output, about whether the process could be maintained through a second winter by refreshing the organic material in spring, about what other organic materials might substitute for horse manure in a county where the livery stable was the only convenient source. Ragna answered all of these questions. She answered them from a knowledge that was partly practical observation and partly the 30 years of Norwegian farming experience she had brought with her from Telemark. And she answered them carefully, because she understood that the questions were going to be applied to real buildings in the next winter, and that the answers needed to be right. By March of 1890, 3 other Wahpeton households had made preliminary arrangements to build organic berms before the following October. Engeset was designing a modification to a new frame house he was building for a family on the south end of town. An outer wall skin set 3 feet away from the primary frame, creating a cavity that would be packed with sawdust and grain chaff in October. He did not call it by any formal name. He called it the Bjørnsdal Wall, which was not a name Ragna had given it or would have chosen, but which stuck anyway, the way informal names for useful things tend to stick in small communities. The explanations that Engeset eventually tracked down in agricultural journals he wrote away to Fargo to borrow, and in a German farming manual that a homesteader 3 counties east had brought from Stuttgart, confirmed everything Ragna had understood from observation and memory. The biological heat of decomposing organic matter had been documented with increasing precision by agricultural scientists throughout the mid-19th century. The chemistry was well established by 1889. Bacteria consuming organic material in aerobic conditions produced carbon dioxide, water, and heat as metabolic byproducts. The heat was not secondary or incidental to the process. It was a direct output of the bacterial metabolism, and it was measurable. A properly managed compost pile reaches internal temperatures between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit at its core. Hot enough to pasteurize weed seeds, hot enough to kill most soil pathogens, hot enough to be felt clearly through a foot of surrounding material on a cold day. Against a building wall, the same process ran at lower temperatures and lower intensities, but the continuity of the output was actually an advantage in a building context. A fire burned hot for 2 hours and then went cold, but bacteria worked at a steady rate across all 24 hours of every day, regardless of whether anyone was awake to tend them. German farmers in the Rhine Valley had formalized the practice as Misthaufen Isolierung midden Insulation in agricultural guides from the 1840s. The technique described in those guides matched closely what Ragna had built. Fresh horse manure, applied in November to exterior barn walls in a tapered berm, moistened to activate decomposition, and left to work through the winter. The temperature improvements described measurable warmth inside the structure compared to adjacent unbermed walls were consistent with what Engeset observed in the forge through November and December. The principle was documented even further back. Columella's first-century agricultural manual, De Re Rustica, described the construction of heated seed beds using a layer of horse manure beneath the growing medium, what modern gardeners call hotbeds. The manure's biological heat warmed the soil from below, allowing seedlings to start weeks earlier than they would in unheated ground. European market gardeners had been building hotbeds using this method continuously from the Roman era through to the present. The practice had never stopped. The knowledge had never been lost. It had simply never been transferred from agricultural applications to building insulation in the American frontier context, where the cultural assumption was that heat came from burning things. Louis Pasteur's published work on fermentation and microbial processes, completed in the 1860s and 1870s, had explained why the old farmers' practice worked at the chemical level. The organisms responsible, the timing of their activity, the conditions that maximized or suppressed their output. Pasteur was explaining bread and wine and beer, but the same organisms and the same chemistry operated in a midden heap. And any farmer who read his work carefully would have been able to make the connection to building applications. None of the farmers in Richland County had read Pasteur. The one farmer who had made the connection from practical observation was a 61-year-old Norwegian widow who had watched Knut Breivold pack his cattle barn in Telemark in 1864 and filed the information away for 25 years. What was new in Wahpeton was not the knowledge. What was new was the intention to apply it to a human dwelling, deliberately, as a primary heating strategy rather than as an accidental benefit to a barn. That step from agricultural practice to architectural application was Ragna's specific contribution, and it was the step that required the particular combination of need, memory, and willingness to be laughed at that her situation in September 1889 had produced. Engeset told the story for the rest of his life. He told it with precision, giving Ragna full credit for the technical insight, which not everyone in his position would have done with equal consistency. The moment he came back to most often, in the telling, was pressing his hands flat against the interior face of the north wall planks on that December morning and finding them warmer than the air in the room. He had been building structures for 22 years and had never felt a wall that was warmer than its interior air. The sensation had genuinely stopped him, not from surprise exactly, but from the need to recalibrate. His entire professional understanding of how buildings worked was organized around the assumption that walls lost heat. A wall that gained heat required a different mental model entirely. He described the wall as living. That was the word he kept using. A living wall. It was not wrong. The bacteria in the sawdust berm were living organisms, consuming organic carbon, producing heat and carbon dioxide in a continuous metabolic cycle that had been running since mid-October. The wall was alive in the same sense that a compost pile is alive, in the same sense that a field of winter wheat pushing through snow is alive slowly, chemically, without visible drama, but producing real output from real biological processes that required nothing from Ragna after the initial setup except the moisture management she did by feel. Signe Dahl never said the words directly. That was not her way, and Ragna did not require them. What Signe did in March 1890, when the last ice had melted and the ground was releasing the particular sharp scent of frozen earth coming back to temperature, the scent that Dakota settlers recognized as the end of winter's threat, the smell of ground that was no longer dangerous, was walk down the road to the forge building, carrying 3 pounds of lard in a cloth bag and a bolt of wool cloth under her arm. She set them at the door. She said, "For your walls," which was a practical statement, but also not only a practical statement. Ragna took the lard and the wool cloth and said thank you, and Signe walked back up the road, and that was the end of it. There are apologies that require specific words, and apologies that are accomplished through specific actions, and the two women had both lived long enough to know the difference. Magnus came in April. He drove out from the farm in the buggy on a Wednesday morning that still had snow in the corners of the fence lines, and he found the forge building in the state that 3 months of winter and completed decomposition produce. The sawdust berm on the north wall had settled into a dense, dark mass, compressed by its own weight and by the freeze-thaw cycling of late winter, and the building's floor had transformed completely. The raw manure and sawdust that Ragna had packed in October was gone. In its place was a dark, crumbly, rich material, black and moist and fine-textured, that smelled of good earth and nothing else. 3 months of bacterial decomposition had converted 12 inches of horse manure and 8 inches of sawdust and grass into something indistinguishable from the best garden soil. Magnus stood in the middle of the room looking at the floor for a long time. He had inherited his father's ability to observe things carefully before speaking. "Are you going to stay here?" he asked. "That's my plan," she said. He opened his mouth and closed it. He had several things he could have said about the building, about the arrangement, about what he should have done differently in September, and none of them were things she needed to hear, and none of them were things that had useful responses attached to them. He drank his tea. He sent $12 in April, $12 in May, and $12 in June. The payments arrived on the second week of every month, which was the first time they had been fully regular since the spring of 1887, when Knut had been alive to set the schedule. He kept sending them, and the regularity was its own kind of statement. Anders Gru built the Bjørnsdal wall on his claim shack the following October, a 6-foot berm of sawdust and manure against the north and west faces, properly moistened, properly covered. His wife Kjellog helped him pack it. Their 4 children, ranging from 4 to 12 by then, helped haul materials in the wheelbarrow. The winter of 1890-91 was not as severe as the Ice Glaze, but it brought several nights below -20, and the Gru claim shack held noticeably warmer than the 3 adjacent properties of equivalent construction, all of which burned through their wood supplies 2 weeks before March. Engeset modified 2 more buildings the following spring, using the principles Ragna had explained. The second one, a 2-room frame house for a family named Storfjord on the west edge of town, incorporated a deliberate double-wall cavity on the north face, packed with grain chaff and sawdust in a ratio Ragna had specified, based on what she knew about the relative decomposition rates of the 2 materials. The cavity was 6 inches wide between the primary frame and an outer skin of tongue and groove boards, and the organic material in it ran biologically active from late October through February. The Storfjord's fuel consumption in the winter of 1891-92 was 1.8 cords of wood. The neighbours on either side, in identical floor plan buildings with standard construction, burned 4.1 and 4.7 cords respectively. The forge building itself was continuously improved through the 1890s. Anders Gru's offer of iron sheeting from the demolished machine shed became the north wall's outer skin in the summer of 1890. Ragna stripped the old warped planks and replaced them with a new outer layer of iron sheeting set 3 feet from the primary frame, creating a permanent cavity that could be packed and repacked with organic material each October. Engeset helped her raise the collapsed rear roof section in 1891, replacing the rusted-through iron with sound sheets salvaged from a granary that had burned in Fairmount the previous spring. By 1892, the forge building had a fully functional double-wall system on the north and west faces, a proper ceiling with a sealed attic cavity above the living space, and a floor that had been repacked each October with fresh organic material since 1889, and had developed a base layer of extraordinarily rich composted earth that Ragna used as garden soil each spring. She grew vegetables in that soil. The decomposed manure and sawdust, 3 years old by 1892, was among the most fertile growing medium in Richland County. She had the best kitchen garden in Wahpeton, people eventually said, and the irony of its origin was not lost on the people who knew the history. What Ragna Bjørnsdal built in 1889 has formal modern names that she would not have recognized. The primary mechanism, exothermic decomposition of organic material, generating heat through aerobic bacterial metabolism, is now well documented in building science literature as a viable supplemental heating strategy in cold climates. The Passive House Institute in Germany, which codified the Passive House standard in the 1990s, identified elimination of heat loss as the primary objective of cold climate building design. Every BTU you retain is a BTU you don't need to generate. Ragna's berm system was doing this in 1889 through a mechanism that modern building scientists now describe as bioactive thermal insulation, insulation that contributes heat rather than merely resisting its loss. The hot bed principle that Columella documented in the 1st century manure heat applied to growing spaces remains in active use today. Every market gardener who builds a hotbed in February to start seedlings is applying the same biology that Ragna applied to a wall in October of 1889. The principle has been in continuous use for 2,000 years because it works regardless of what name you give it or what context you put it in. Bacteria do not care whether they are in a garden bed or a building wall or a compost toilet. They process organic carbon, they generate heat, they do not require fuel payments. The snow insulation that accumulated against the forge building's south and east walls through December worked on physics that are equally ancient and equally reliable. An Inuit Karmak, a semi-subterranean winter shelter, deliberately encouraged snow accumulation against its exterior walls because the builders understood that packed snow at R1 to R3 per inch was free. Insulation that arrived on its own schedule and improved as the winter progressed. Norse longhouses in Greenland were built with their north and west walls set into hillsides, not because of aesthetic preference, but because earth contact eliminated wind exposure, and the ground provided a thermal buffer that no constructed wall of that era could match. The Dakota homesteaders who survived the hardest winters were disproportionately the ones who had built dugouts or packed sod berms against their frame houses, the ones who had put earth and organic material between themselves and the wind, instead of trusting that a stove running hard enough could compensate for walls that weren't doing their job. Ragna's limestone forge ring was the same technology, at a smaller scale, that Finnish and Russian masonry heaters had been running for 400 years. A Finnish tulikivi, a soapstone masonry heater, stores heat in dense stone and releases it slowly over 12 to 24 hours. The specific heat of soapstone runs slightly higher than limestone, but the operating principle is identical. Charge the mass with a hot fire, seal the fire chamber, Let the stored BTU migrate out through the stone surface over many hours. The Danish word for this stored heat release is varme afgivelse, heat-giving, literally, and the Scandinavian peoples who had developed these heaters over centuries understood intuitively that a heater which gives warmth for 12 hours from a 2-hour fire is fundamentally more efficient than one that requires continuous fuel to maintain surface temperature. Ragna had not grown up with a tulikivi. Her family's farmhouse in Telemark used an iron stove, but she recognized the limestone ring's potential for the same purpose. The first time she pressed her hands against its cold surface in October. The difference between Ragna's approach and what Wahpeton's settlers were doing was not a difference in available knowledge. Every element of her system was documented somewhere in agricultural and scientific literature that existed in 1889. The difference was in how she was thinking about the problem. The standard frontier approach was inside out. Start with the heat source, scale the fuel supply to match the heat loss, and accept whatever temperature resulted. When the fuel ran short, the temperature fell. When the temperature fell enough, people died. The approach assumed that walls were passive barriers of fixed resistance that you could not improve without building a better house, which required money, materials, and labor that most settlers did not have. Ragna's approach was outside in. Start with the building envelope, reduce what the walls were losing, and then apply as little heat as necessary to the reduced loss. The walls were not passive in her system, she made them active. They generated heat, stored heat, managed the temperature differential between inside and outside in ways that reduced rather than accepted heat loss. And she did all of this with materials that cost nothing and required only the kind of physical labor that a 61-year-old woman with a wheelbarrow and 4 weeks of October could supply. She burned approximately 0.4 cords of wood, equivalent through the entire winter of 1891-92, the second full winter she occupied the forge. Per Olstad, in a properly constructed frame house directly adjacent to the lumberyard, well built, fully insulated by the standards of the day, burned 5.2 cords. Ragna used 1/13 of her neighbour's fuel to maintain a warmer average interior temperature. The difference was not in the size of the buildings. The forge was 396 square feet. Olstad's house was somewhat larger. The difference was in where the heat was coming from and how much of it the building was losing before it reached the people inside. Ragna Bjørnsdal lived in the forge building until 1904. She died at 76. In the building she had bought for $7.40 in January of that year, the same month that had been arranged against her 15 years before. She had outlasted the Ice Glaze and the next 14 winters, through one of them with the help of Engeset and Anders Gru and the sawdust and manure that Per Olstad kept supplying without being asked after 1890, because he had come to understand that the building next to his lumberyard was part of what made the neighbourhood work. The forge building itself was torn down in 1911 when the lumberyard expanded its storage yard. By then, Engeset had incorporated the berm principle into 4 other buildings in Richland County, and 2 of those buildings were still standing and still using organic wall cavity insulation as of 1920. One of them, the Storfjord House on the west edge of Wahpeton, was inhabited by the Storfjord's daughter and her husband and their 2 children, who had repacked the north wall cavity every October since 1892, without being entirely certain why they were doing it, because it was what the house required, and the house stayed warm. The wall was alive. It had been alive for 30 years by then, running its slow bacterial chemistry through each Dakota winter, outlasting the woman who had first understood what it could do. That is the kind of knowledge that does not die when the person who carried it does. It moves outward, from person to person, and building to building, the way heat moves through stone slowly, without drama. But once it is in there, it stays.